Hello chess buddies, welcome to Amici Chess University. Exceptional, fantastic, incredible, marvelous, outstanding, phenomenal, you name it, and this game takes it. We witnessed an insane chess match in Vergani Cup Italy, a speciality on its own that will surely be a legend in years to come. From the position of losing, this round 8 battle scripted a stunning comeback from Hans Niemann, the US Grandmaster, and his opponent here was International Master Milton Pantzar from Sweden. You really don't want to miss this, so let's get straight into the game. Milton here had the white pieces and he begins with d4 going for the queen pawn opening. Niemann replied with knight to f6 going for the Indian game. Knight to f3 by white going for the knight's variation of the Indian game. And here black played e6, g3 by white and b5 by black. Now white brings the bishop to g2, targeting this long diagonal. Black does the same. It brings the light square bishop to b7. Castling by white and black played d5. Here white played a4 and black puts the pawn to b4. Here white played c4 and black plays n passing, capturing that pawn. Knight captured the pawn on c3 and black played bishop to e7, getting ready for castling. White plays bishop to f4 and black also castles. Now there are two games in the database in this position where white played queen to b3 and both the games ended in a draw. However here, Milton played rook to c1 and it is as of move 10 that we have a completely new game. The further idea here is to bring the knight to b5 and then targeting this weak pawn at c7 thrice. Black doesn't allow this, it played a6. Now Milton played queen to b3, attacking this bishop at b7 and Niemann played rook to a7. Now Milton played knight to e5, Niemann played knight to d7, knight captured the knight on d7, queen captured the knight on d7. Now Milton pushes the pawn to a5, Niemann brings his light square bishop to c6. His idea is to play rook to b7 next and targeting this b file, attacking the queen. So Milton moves the queen back to c2. Now both the queen and the dark square bishop are well aligned in parallel. Now Niemann brings his non-active rook to b8 and here white plays b3. Now black plays pawn to h6, preventing the dark square bishop from coming to g5 and white plays knight to a4. Now the bishop at c6 is attacked twice by the queen as well as the rook. Here bishop captured the knight on a4. Pawn captured the bishop on a4. Now here Niemann played rook to b4, targeting both the a4 pawn as well as the d4 pawn. Now Milton can save only one of those two pawns. However, he had a different idea here. He played queen to c6, offering the queen exchange. Here black plays bishop to d6, offering the bishop exchange. White moves the dark square bishop back to d2, targeting the rook at b4. And rook captures the pawn on a4. Now black is a pawn up and in a very good position. Here white played pawn to e3, providing support to this d4 pawn, and black played rook to a2, targeting this dark square bishop on d2, and Milton brought his non-active rook to d1, providing support to this bishop, and here Niemann played bishop to a3, targeting the rook at c1, and Milton moved the rook to c2, offering the rook exchange. However, Niemann didn't went for the rook exchange. He captured the queen at c6 with his queen, and rook captured the black queen at c6, and here Niemann played rook to b2, controlling the b file, and Milton brought his light square bishop back to f1, targeting the a6 pawn twice. Niemann decided to be proactive in this position. He decided to give his a6 pawn and played rook to b7, concentrating on bringing his rook to the white king's territory. Here bishop captured the pawn on a6 and Niemann played rook to b3. He actually decided to sacrifice the c7 pawn in exchange for a full-blown attack on the white's half. Here white happily obliges. It captured the pawn on c7, going a material up. But Niemann continued with his attacking strategy, bringing the knight to e4. Now the knight and the rook both are targeting this dark square bishop at d2. So Milton decided to bring his dark square bishop to e1. The weak pawn at f2 is under attack from the knight as well as the rook. However, it is defended by the bishop at e1. And Niemann continued his brilliancy here. He played rook to b1, offering white the exchange of rooks. However, capturing this rook will not bode well for white, because if white rook captures the rook on b1, then black rook will capture the rook on b1 and the dark square bishop at e1 will be under a lot of trouble. And if king tries to move to f1, then black will play bishop to b4, attacking this dark square bishop twice, and white will end up sacrificing it. So after rook to b1 by black, Milton played bishop to e2. However, this move also turned the tide slightly in favor of black. Now rook captures the rook on d1, bishop captures the rook on d1, targeting the rook at b3, and here black played rook to b1, attacking both the knights. And this is an insanely difficult situation for white to handle. The rook cannot come to c1, and if white moves the light square bishop at d1, then it will lose the dark square bishop at e1. and if white tries to move the king to f1, then it will end up losing the light square bishop. So in this complicated scenario, Milton decided to push his pawn on a5 instead. He played pawn to a6, only 2 steps away from promoting to the new queen. Niemann has to prevent this. He played bishop to c5. Here Milton could have pushed the pawn to a7, but Niemann would have played rook to a1, going for a double attack on the a7 pawn. So he played rook to c8, delivering a check, and the king moved to h7. Now Milton had a very interesting idea. He captured the bishop on c5. His theory was if knight captures the rook on c5, then pawn captures the knight on c5, and white will have 2 passed pawns, only few steps away from promoting to the queen, and black will be under huge pressure to stop this from happening. So after the rook captures the bishop on c5, Niemann captured the light square bishop at d1. Here Milton played rook to a5. He sacrificed the dark square bishop on e1 in exchange for control of the a file. Niemann captured the bishop on e1, delivering a check, and the king moved to g2. Here Niemann played rook to e2, threatening another check by capturing this f2 pawn, and Milton pushed the pawn to a7, one step away from obtaining a new queen. Rook captured the pawn on f2, delivering a check, and Milton played king to g1. Now Niemann cannot give checks anymore, and also cannot prevent white from obtaining the new queen in the next step. He played rook to d2, and Milton pushed the pawn to a8, obtaining a new queen. Look at the position of the white. 4 pawns, a rook and a queen against black with 5 pawns, a rook and a knight. The engines and fans unanimously thought that white is winning this game, and black had no chance to come back from this, but Niemann was not the player who was going to give up. Let's see how the game proceeded. Here Niemann played rook to d1, giving a check, and white played king to g2. Rook to d2 by black, giving a check again, and white moved the king to f1. Now rook captured the pawn on h2. Here Milton played queen to b8, targeting this diagonal. He wanted to bring the queen to f4. Niemann here played rook to f2, delivering a check, and white moved the king to e1, and black played rook to f3, targeting the e3 as well as the g3 pawn, and white played king to e2, attacking the rook, and black played rook to f2, delivering a check, and king moved back to e1. Now black played rook to f3 again, continuing to apply the pressure on both these pawns. Now white played rook to a3, rotating the e3 pawn while giving up the pawn at g3. Here knight captured the pawn on g3, and white played queen to b5. The idea for Milton is to prevent the rook of Niemann from giving a check by controlling this diagonal. Here Niemann started pushing his pawns. He played h5, and white played queen to d3, giving a check, and black moved the king to newly created empty square h6. Here Milton played rook to a2. His idea is to bring the rook to h2 file. However, Niemann here found another wonderful idea. He played knight to f5, targeting the e3 pawn twice, and here white played rook to e2. Niemann continued to push his pawn. He played h4. Milton had a very difficult time breaking through this diagonal because all these squares were controlled by the black pawns. So he played queen to d2. His idea was to push the pawn from e3 to e4 next, targeting the knight at f5, while also simultaneously delivering a discovered check. It was a great plan. However, Niemann was ready for this. He played pawn to g5, stopping that idea. Here Milton played king to d1. He wanted to bring his queen to e1 and target the h file with both the queen as well as the rook to handle his passed pawns. Here Niemann continued to push his pawn. He played h3, and Milton played rook to f2, offering the idea of rook exchange. Niemann declined this. He played rook to g3. The engine suggested move in this position for white was playing queen to b4 and then play queen to f8, deliver a check. However, Milton didn't go for this. He captured the knight on f5, and here Niemann didn't capture the rook back immediately. He played rook to g1, delivering a check, and Milton moved his king to e2. Now pawn captured the rook on f5. This was a very good move because now Niemann has an idea to play his rook to g2 and delivering a check, and there was no rook on f file to prevent it. Milton realized this. He played king to f3, stepping away from the second rank, and Niemann played king to h5. He wanted to push his pawn to g4 next, and he wanted his king to be away from this diagonal. And Milton played queen to h2, targeting the h3 pawn as well as the rook on g1. But Niemann was ready for this. He played pawn to g4, and now white played king to f4. Here Niemann played rook to g2, offering his rook. And if queen captured the rook on g2, then pawn will capture the queen on g2, obtaining the queen in the next step and effectively winning the game for black. So after rook to g2, Milton was forced to play queen to h1, and here black played king to h4 with the rook to f2 check coming next. Milton played queen to f1, and here Niemann pushed his pawn to g3. This is a very effective move because now the rook with the protection of the g3 pawn delivers a check by playing rook to f2. Then queen will be forced to capture the rook, and the pawn at g3 will capture the queen. So after pawn to g3 by black, white moved the king to e5 to escape from the check. However, black here continued with the plan, playing rook to f2. Of course, the queen cannot capture the rook, so white played queen to c1. Here Niemann played his pawn to g2, with only a step away from obtaining the new queen. And white here played e4. Milton wanted to bring his queen to h6 next. Here Niemann played rook to f1, and Milton here played queen to h6, delivering a check. Now black king moved to g3, and white played queen to g5, delivering another check. And black king moved to h2, very safe square. Now what can Milton play? He played queen to d2, pinning this g2 pawn from moving to g1. So Niemann had to move the king here. He played king to h1, and here Milton played queen to e3, trying to capture this h3 pawn and deliver a check. And here Niemann played pawn to h2, and it was in this position after move 66 that Milton resigned the game. Niemann is going to get a new queen in the next move, and battling the combination of rook and queen with only a queen will be too much. So that's the game. Games like this are so special and can make anyone love chess, because both the players came up with some incredible moves, and it was hence Niemann against all the odds who turned the tables from a losing position to come up with a stunning victory. If you have any thoughts on this game, feel free to share. Thank you for watching. Take care. See you.